I'm Heidi Samoker. I'm a principal planner at CROG and the project manager for our regional housing strategy. And we're really pleased tonight to have our project consultant, Goman+York, share their findings on demographics and housing needs within our 38 town CROG region. We really wanted to better understand the trends in our region, which may or may not match up with trends we're hearing about in the state or even across the country when we talk about housing and affordable housing. We think it's really important to understand the dynamics that impact housing in our region, and we think that benefits all of our communities, but it also helps us at CROG figure out what tools our communities may need as they address housing. So I do want to introduce the CROG team that is either in the house or will be in the house in a few minutes. Jacob Knowlton is a community development planner who is also working on the regional housing strategy. Kyle Scheel is a principal planner also working on this project. Not in the room, but coming soon are Caitlin Palmer, the Director of Planning, Regional Planning and Development, and Matt Hart, our Executive Director. I would encourage everybody to introduce themselves in the chat, just your name, where you live, and if you are a Planning and Zoning Commission member, a resident, town staff, or any other affiliation that you want to share about yourself. As we go through tonight, if you have questions, you can either hold them until after the presentation when we have a Q&A, or if you don't think you'll remember your question, throw it in the chat, and we may, throughout the presentation, respond to questions or save them until the end. There's a lot of information in the slides tonight. So we will post them next week on our project website, and we'll also post the recording in case you want to go back and look at the recording again or to share it with others who weren't able to attend. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Don Poland from Goman+York.
Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate the introduction. So just give me a minute here to share my screens and work out my screens. Great. So hopefully you see my screen in full size. So this presentation, as Heidi said, is on our analysis of housing markets, housing affordability, and some other aspects of housing within the CROG region, but I also touch on some national trends and some statewide trends. As Heidi said, there is a lot of information on these slides. I've organized them in such a way and using my cursor also to try and direct you to what I think are the most important data points. But the slides will be available ultimately, and this recording will be available. So I want to start off with uh, it's actually just three slides on housing market dynamics. The first is spatial organization of housing markets. I think we need to be clear and understand that all locations for housing are not created equally. Housing markets organize at the metropolitan scale with many submarkets. And we'll see later on that kind of each community in the CROG region is probably its own submarket, and then there's probably further submarkets within each of those communities. Accessibility to employment centers drives land value. So time, distance, and transportation impact the value of land. Value is greatest nearer the core and employment centers and lower at the periphery. That's where commute times actually become important. How long does it take you to get to work and so forth? The more accessible the location, the greater the value of land and housing. And the graphic at the bottom here shows, actually it's a comparative sales analysis of a same size house, same number of bedrooms, similar size lot, bathrooms, garage, so forth and so on, and how within 5 miles of the center, $195 a square foot, and 20 miles from the center, $136 a square foot. And that was done pre-COVID. Those numbers would be much higher today. So housing affordability is a problem to solve. I think it's important that there's two ways to look at it. The first is income. Households own too little to afford housing. And this is most notable in lower income households, but different markets function in different ways. And I'm going to point to some differences in how we can best understand it. Uh, Housing costs. Housing is too expensive for households to afford. This is a nuanced difference between the two, kind of the flip side of the same coin, but I'll talk more about it as I move through this presentation. Solutions, very simplified. Raise household income or lower the cost of housing. Easier said, very much so, than actually done. So affordability is a problem to solve, provides an opportunity to think carefully about housing markets affordability and ultimately government intervention. How does government intervene in the housing market? Most specifically in the context of affordability. Last in this kind of introductory section is the drivers of housing demand. Jobs, population, household formations, and income are the drivers of housing. If jobs are growing, population is growing. If population is growing, then the number of households are increasing. If household formations are increasing, then demand for housing is also increasing, and demand for new construction is increasing. That being said, you could have stagnant job growth and stagnant population growth and still have housing demand through household formations. So, for example, two roommates go their separate ways. You gain a new household formation. A couple gets divorced. You gain a household formation. Your 27-year-old child finally moves out of your basement and into their own apartment, and you gain a household formation. So household formations can still occur even with jobs and population growth being negative or stagnant. And income basically provides us with a view as to where the housing market is actually organizing. And I'll talk about some of that later on in some of the slides. So let's talk about income first, because it becomes important in the context of housing and especially in the context of affordability. I use a Pew research definition for what is middle income, and Pew's definition essentially is households with an income of two-thirds of median U.S. household income, adjusted for household size, and that ranges from 53,000 to 161,000. That is the definition I use when I talk about middle income. I provide Connecticut and the CROG range based on the same formula, just for contextual purposes. But if I'm talking about where does middle income start, it's at 53,000, not the 62.8. And down here, I then provide a table that just shows us comparatively the US, Connecticut, and CROG at the median household income, 80%, 60%, 50%, and 30% AMI. And then anyone under that two-thirds is lower income. Anyone above that two-thirds uh, is higher income, or two times as higher income. As you'll notice on national scale, there have been changes in the distribution of our income. You often hear in the media that our middle class is shrinking, and rightfully so, going from 61% of households to 51% between 1971 and 2023. However, what we don't often hear is that the greatest gains are actually in the upper income cohort, that there's more upper income households today than there was previously. However, we can't ignore the fact that lower income households have increased by 3 percentage points also. So, CROG housing and household income, 71% of CROG's households have incomes over $50,000. So, using that, the 53,000 as the lower end of middle income on the national level, These households are mostly middle income households. 28.8% of CROG households have incomes below 50,000. 57.8 of CROG households have incomes over 75,000, and 59% of owner-occupied CROG households have incomes over 100,000. I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. And then 52.4% of renter-occupied households have incomes less than 50,000, and 27.5 have incomes less than 35,000. The federal poverty rate for a family of four is 32,000, just to provide context there. So rhetorically, I ask these questions. Uh, who does the housing home ownership market serve? Who does the rental market serve? And who needs affordable housing the most? If we go over here, let's answer the home ownership one first and foremost. The fact is, if we look here, 59%, as I already said, of owner occupied housing households are over $100,000 in income. And look at that, actually the largest percentile is over 150,000. The fact is the home ownership market serves the highest income households the most. We then look here on the rental side. Uh, this is the 52% of renter households that actually have incomes less than 50,000 for the regional income. So the rental market, the majority is serving lower income households. However, I don't want to ignore the fact that there are higher income households there in the rental segment of the housing market. Also note here, when we look at the types of households, family households, married couple households have the highest income, and they are the most likely, at least historically, owners and occupants of owner-occupied housing. Last, I want to point out non-family households and renter households. I don't want to create the impression by these median incomes that non-family households and renter households are poor. While those incomes are low, one right at the bottom end of middle income, and then the renters are lower, I think we have to recognize, which I think we'll see later, is the increase in one-person households in the housing market. That now in Connecticut, 29.9% of households are single person. That means there's a much higher percentage of households today that are single income versus historically where we had a lot more dual income households. So household incomes have dropped based on the change in size and structure of households. Median income by race and population by race. I'm going to start on the population side, on the right-hand side of this slide. I think it's important to recognize that we are diversifying, that the CROG region is diversifying over time. As you can see, the declines in white person population and the increases in Hispanic, Black, and also Asian populations. So we are becoming a more diverse region, which is a good thing. But we have to take into account median household incomes by race when we start talking about housing. As we'll see, Asian households tend to be the wealthiest, followed by white households. And then it is Black households and Hispanic households that actually suffer from what I would call disparate impacts. You know, they are negatively impacted in the context of income, that there is a correlation between income and race in our country, and those populations have lower incomes. I'll come back to that later on. So, some demographic stuff. Any questions at this point, Heidi, that I may want to take? Oh, you're muted.
I'm not seeing any in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll continue on. Uh, so just some basic things here. We'll start over here with household populations and total populations. If you look in most recent times, 2020 to 2025, we are seeing a contraction in household population and also a contraction in total population within the CROG region. It's not significant, it's not large. I would call it more stagnation than decline. But if you go back, you can also see that total population, household population increased fairly dramatically, or not dramatically, but did increase between 2000 and 2010. And we can see the total population over this period of time here in this bar graph. Uh, Here we have population broken out by generation. And I just want to note that right now, the two largest generations are the millennials and Gen Z. So we have a large younger population within our population structure with housing needs. I also want to point out that unfortunately, the older silent generation and the baby boomer generation are reaching ages where they are passing on, and therefore at that upper end, we will start seeing some meaningful contractions in population. So total households have actually increased over time from 2,355 up to 396 in 2025, while family households have actually increased at a most slower rate, at a slower rate. And I think that's important to note because it's this changing household structure. The increase in one-person households and two-person households, the increase in non-family households are more substantial within the housing market overall than actual family households, which dominated the housing market in past generations. And we see the comparatives there. So population and age is impacting population growth, deaths exceeding births, and housing demand is driven by household growth. So right now we are seeing some growth in the market. I'll get into some supply and demand a bit later. But if nothing changes, if we don't see more job growth and economic prosperity, then it's possible with the aging out baby boomers, we could actually see some more meaningful contractions in population, and that means also contractions in households. So, owner versus renter income distribution. Very quickly looking at this, we see that owners are wealthier overall than renters. That being said, this higher end of the rental market, I would say, is the new construction market where you have the highest rents, the newest, product. And then the below 50% AMI is the affordable housing market. Not to say that it's all affordable, but that these are the population, the household incomes that we should be concerned about in the context of housing affordability, or should be concerned most about. Some breakdowns here. Percent of income on housing by householder age for owner occupied. What I want to highlight here is these three shadings at the upper end here, that as a population ages, then a higher percentage of household income goes towards housing. And that makes sense, especially with retirees. You exit the workforce, you're on a fixed income, and there's a higher percentage of your income going to housing. So percent of income on housing by household income level. The reverse is true on this one. We see higher percentages of income going to housing as we go down the income brackets. And once again, that makes sense, right? A lower income household is going to be more challenged by the costs of housing. Same thing over here on the renter side. There is something interesting here. The youngest populations are about as cost burdened as the oldest populations in the rental market, and pretty stable or similar in those middle age brackets there. 7% of income on housing, household income level. Once again, we see as income goes down, the percentage of income going towards housing goes up. And therefore, we're seeing that cost burden on lower income households. Renters ultimately being the most cost burden. So now to housing. Um, so some basic housing data in the CROG region. Total housing units shown here on the top line, renter occupied and owner occupied. Some interesting things here. Just the CROG housing stock is older and aging, and we see that over here. Look at this. Only what, 10.8% of the housing stock has been constructed since 2000 over the past 25 years. So that means almost 90%, 89% of our housing stock is more than 25 years older. And then go back 90, 90 minus 20 gives us 70. Nearly 70% of the housing stock is pre 1980. And then the proportion of owner to renter units has remained mostly constant over the last 25 years. This really surprised us when we looked at this data point that we've seen, and we'll see it in other slides, we've seen a real meaningful uptick over the past decade in multifamily housing. But we haven't seen a meaningful change over the past 25 years in the distribution between owners and renters. It's stayed really stable. So, the other thing I think is important to point out, and this looks at mobility, or actually how often people move. What is the most recent move-in date? I think there tends to be a perception out there that homeowners are long-lasting and renters are transient. And when you look at the data, it actually becomes evident that both homeowners and renters are transient. We move a lot over the course of our lifetime, even when we're in a home ownership state. And so just look here. The owners are in the dark, 5%, 17.8%, and 24. Me doing math quickly is very hard. What, just over 40% of homeowners have moved into their current property in the last 15 years. That's a huge number. So my point being, now it's much higher with renters. Yes, they do turn over more than homeowners do. But I think as planners, and I think as we plan for our communities, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that, or shouldn't make the assumption that our homeowners have actually been here forever. A large share of them are new to our community. Then some additional data. When we look at total housing units and the breakdown by bedrooms, we're also looking here at household size, and we're looking at style of housing, whether it's single family detached or missing middle or multifamily. So 57.7% of our housing units have three bedrooms or more. However, 62.2% of the CROG region occupied households are one or two persons. That's a huge shift in demographics that almost two-thirds of housing units are just one or two persons today. 42% of renter-occupied households are one person, and 69% of renter-occupied households are one and two persons. This becomes important when we get to talking about things, and we will on later slides, things like school district enrollments in housing. Rental housing generates very few school-age children and school district enrollments because 69% of the housing unit, well, 42% are single occupants that would have no kids, and 69% are one and two person occupants. Once again, these changing demographics of household structure loom large within our existing housing stock and within the housing market overall. I would argue, or kind of our findings is that CROG's housing stock was built for past generations, larger households, not smaller households. That's why we have a large percentage of the housing stock with so many bedrooms. And CROG's housing stock does not match today's households and their preferences for the housing they want. Let me be clear, I'm not picking on CROG in this sense. I could say the same thing for Connecticut, and I could probably say the same thing for much of America. Definitely, overwhelmingly for the Northeast and the Midwestern United States. When you move into the South and the Southwest, you do see a more modern housing product that's been built in more recent times. So let's look at state housing permits. in recent housing data. So we're looking at the period from 1997 to 2024, and on the top is the state pattern of permits per year. You can see we had a lot of net unit gains going back to the late 90s and early 2000s, but things changed with the crash of the housing market in '08, the recession in '09, and our very slow recovery back until COVID hits, and then this new post-pandemic housing market. CROG actually tracks very similarly to the state, right? Lots of housing being produced pre 2008, less housing being produced post 2008. Some good upticks here in the most recent years, 23 and 24. This is the most interesting here, both on the statewide level and on the CROG level. And that is, we had a housing market historically. I mean, even if we went back further into the 90s and into the 80s, that's been dominated by the single family housing product. But in recent times, both at the state and at the CROG region level, we see a shift in the housing market. The housing market is now dominated by the multifamily product. That's why everyone out there on social media, I just saw it today on some articles about housing in West Hartford, where everyone's like, there's too much housing being built, too much multifamily, too many apartments. Who are the people moving into all these? But the fact is, the market has changed because the demographics have changed. As the single person households and the two-person households have continued to increase, as the households, the family households with children have continued to contract, then our needs and wants for housing have changed. There's also economic things that are going on that I'll get to as I move through this. Permits by municipality. We allowed the data to tell us what were kind of the peak areas of permitting. So 97 to 2006, as you saw previously, a lot of housing being built. And then 2015 to 23, a lot of housing being built. Not much was built in between. So we let the data set up these two tables. And we see the top 10 communities for housing permits on the left-hand side here. And we see a large number of permits, ranging from 1,100 up to almost 2,100 permits per community over this period of time. But when we jump ahead to the 2015-2023, we see that only four top 10 communities appear in both periods. There's been a shift. We have a bunch of new communities, six new communities in this period that weren't previously represented here, and six have dropped out from there. Hartford and New Britain. Hartford shows up in this one, and New Britain only shows up in this one. Hartford and New Britain are kind of unique. They actually both demolished more housing than the housing they built, and they account for 63% of the region's demolitions overall. So, in this context, I'm kind of ignoring them a little bit from a permitting standpoint because there's something unique about them. Changes in the top 10 housing permit communities is reflecting the shift from single family to multifamily housing. Communities that have allowed and realized multifamily housing have climbed into the top 10. Simsbury, Bloomfield, West Hartford, Newington, and Granby being very notable in this context. What is interesting, I want to point out Glastonbury with 1,358 permits back in this period, South Windsor with 1,100 back in that period. Both of them drop out, and respectively, their permits decline to 343 and 450. I'm using those to just kind of highlight the shift in the marketplace on how much fewer housing is being built now than was being built previously, and then also the shift in what communities are building housing. And then look here, these top six communities, uh, the percentage of total CROG area permits are really outpacing the percentage of similar rankings back in the prior period. And this is where the multifamily housing is making the difference. So, change in household type, non-family, and size, one and two person, along with social cultural changes, such as we marry less, we marry later, and we have fewer children, are driving declines in young person populations and school district enrollments. The CROG region lost almost 26,000 enrollments from 2006 to 2024, or essentially 17% of school district enrollments. The only community to have meaningful increases in enrollments over this period is South Windsor, and that is from 2015 until now. Uh, they had declined from like 2004 until 2014. They had lost 816 enrollments. They have now gained those back plus some. I'm going to talk a bit more about that on another slide. But these changes in demographics, once again, are surfacing in areas like enrollments. There are a couple communities within the region that their enrollments have, maybe upticked, 20 students or 30 students, but nothing meaningful like South Windsor. And this is where I want to talk about specifically kind of that South Windsor data. South Windsor enrollment gains are explained by a quality school district, low cost of entry into home ownership, and an accessible location. If we look back to 2016 median household incomes, South Windsor was the most affordable housing of the Derg B. They're kind of the more desirable school districts. It was the most affordable in 2016 of all 8 Derby communities. Granby was a close second. And then we skip ahead to 2022. South Windsor is still the most affordable out of those communities. Granby's a quick second. Big difference between Granby and South Windsor is total population. South Windsor is more than 2 times the size, 2 times the household, and in a much better, more central location, good access to the highway and high amenity values, which explains at the end of the day, South Windsor's existing housing stock was accessible to first-time home buyers at these price points, and therefore, was a great community to buy into for first-time home buyers, which are more likely younger, which are more likely households with children, which result ultimately in increases in enrollments, as we see down here. Today, though, in this post-COVID market, just move ahead a little bit, and the median home value in South Windsor is 408,000. It's no longer a first-time home buyer market, and I would anticipate, unless something changed drastically, that they would see a flattening of enrollments moving forward. So, housing price to income, a comparative analysis. The housing price to income analysis done by the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies gets a lot of attention on a national scale. It's a way of looking at comparatively household income, the median household income of a region, to the median home value of a home in the housing market. And I'm going to go through a number of slides here. I want to point out, I want to start down here before I get to my narrative. If you go back to 1980, Hartford, New York, Boston, uh, and the DC markets all had very similar price to income ratios. There wasn't much difference in us. That changes a little bit as we move through the 80s and that 80 boom period. We start to see Boston and New York, outperform. Hartford stays right with them, though. Move through the recession of the 90s into the early 2000s, and something changes. This is really where we start seeing the rebirth of the large cities. This is where you're getting all that narrative around the return to the cities and so forth. Uh, and you see housing affordability, price to income skyrocket uh, in the DC and in the New York and Boston metro. And you see Hartford peaking, but not peaking as high as the other three. And now you go through then the next recession after 2008, and we come into the COVID market here. And once again, you see these trend lines kind of reflecting what they were doing in the previous cycle. So in Boston, New York, I would argue affordability is a problem of housing cost. Housing is too expensive for most households to afford. When the cost of housing is, 6.5 times that of household incomes, even a household earning $140,000 could be priced out of the market. Harvard peaks at 4.3. We bottom out at, I think, 2.9. We peak again at 4.2 and bottom out at 4. And we're heading towards a peak, but right now we're back at 4. In Harvard, I would argue affordability is a problem of income. Households earn too little to afford housing. And that's where that nuanced difference I introduced earlier. In these hyper markets, housing cost is a huge problem. In a moderate market like Hartford's, uh, I believe it's actually income that's the bigger problem to solve than a hyperinflated housing market. So look at LA and San Francisco compared to Hartford and Phoenix. Once again, really different housing market problems. Unfortunately, at the national scale, national media, kind of the 15 largest housing markets get all the attention. So we always hear about the exorbitant cost of housing today in LA, New York, Boston, and so forth, but that's not necessarily reflective of the Harfords and the Phoenixes. We also compared Hartford out to then CROG's similar metropolitan areas. So the Hartford MSA to the Albany to the Providence to the Springfield to the Worcester. And look, go back to 1980. Hartford had the highest price to income ratio of the three of the markets. Three of them were below price to income of three. Whoops, sorry again. Uh, and Hartford peaks up at the top in the 80s. Hartford is then the fourth peaking metro in the 2000, early 2000s market boom. And Hartford is still there. You can see ultimately the influence of the growth and value of the Boston market is spreading out and influencing the Worcester and the Providence market. And then the four MSAs in Connecticut, which are the Hartford MSA, the Bridgeport, the New Haven, and the Norwich, New London. And ultimately, you see there were differences back in 1980. The Bridgeport Fairfield County MSA has been the highest, most costly region consistently throughout this. And I would argue that it's a problem of housing costs down in Fairfield County. Whereas in the other three MSAs, it's more of a problem of income. The housing prices aren't that exorbitant that the middle class is being priced out, whereas in a higher end market, the middle class could be being priced out. So we then did a deep dive into price to income within the CROG region across all 38 communities. We're showing you the top five and the bottom five because these slides would be overwhelming if we were showing you all 38 communities. But here, what we are doing is we are dividing the median household value, median home value of a community by its own median household income. And what we see is that the high home value communities are also high income value communities, and they all fall between 3 and 4, 3 point something in price to income. And that range of 3 to 4 is really kind of a stable, what we expect, affordable housing market from a mortgage standpoint. And so they're ranked here by median home value. The bottom five become Stafford, Vernon, East Hartford, Hartford, and New Britain. What becomes interesting, the two lowest value home value communities with two of the lowest income, median household incomes, price to income have higher ratios. and that is income is very low in Hartford. So for median household income in Hartford to even afford a reasonably priced median home of 254,000 is a cost burden. So, what this is basically showing is that incomes are matching to home values within the communities. That most communities are affordable to themselves. Their populations can afford housing within those communities. This is the same calculation, we just now ranked by median household income to see who the top five were versus the top five, see who the bottom five were versus the bottom five here, with then the ratios in the middle and the home values there. And then over here, we ranked price to income. What are the price to income ratios? The five highest price to income ratios range from 3.95 in Plainville to 5.44 in Hartford. The lowest, 2.94 in Stafford, down to 2.65 in Hebron. I highlight South Windsor here because I spoke about them previously, and you see how affordable South Windsor is to itself, with a median household income of 140,000, median home value of 408,000. It comes in below a 3 on price to income. This is the more interesting page. This is where we took the CROG median household income and divided that into the median home values of the communities to see how affordable each community was to the median home value, the median household income of the region. And then what we see is the Avon, Canton, Glastonbury, Farmington, Suffield are all up over fives and become a stretch for the regional median household income. At the same time, the Staffords and East Hartfords and New Britain Hartfords have very low ratios and are very accessible and affordable to the median household income. So the median home value in the region is 364,000, and the price to income ratio on a region-wide level is 3.8. This is where I just want to get back to that race issue or the correlation between race and income. Price to income ratios by race based on the regional home values is 3.75 for white households, 5.45 for black households, and 6.18 for Hispanic households. So we need to be aware of that these minority populations, due to disparities in income, are the most cost burdened trying to access the home ownership market. We then looked at rent ratios to income in the context of the percent of households paying over 30%. And what we find out is 29.1% of renter households in the CROG region are cost burdened, paying 30% or more of their household income on housing. So housing supply and demand, a lot of talk as of late about we're lacking in supply, that demand is high, and we've underbuilt housing on a statewide level, and we need to build a lot more housing. So we wanted to test that against the actual numbers. So this is statewide data. This is not CROG data. I'm going to start with this column here because it is the calculation from 1990 to 2025 that gives us that total. As I said, household formations are the primary driver of housing. So approximately 190,000 household formations occurred over this 35-year period. Is my math right? Yes, 35 years. During that period, accounting for total builds and then demolitions, we had a net gain of 219,000 housing units. So 29,871 more housing units were constructed than the 189,000 household formations. So supply outpaced actually demand. I then want to go and look at 1990 to 2010, that 20-year period, because we actually had job loss in that period. We did have, though, 140,000 household formations, and we had a net gain of 152,000 housing units. And once again, supply was outpacing demand by almost 12,000 units. Last, 2010 to 2025, household formations, 49,000, uh, and net gain in housing units, just shy of 29,000. Demand outpacing supply by 20,000 units, or just over 20,000 units. That being said, going down here, you have to accept the fact that there was almost 12,000 surplus housing units starting in 2010. Then the 20,000 fewer units built going out to 2025. So the net shortage is actually 8,300 units. My take on this, if you go back and look at the permit data, we don't build much housing at all from 2010 all the way on to 2015. Very little housing is built. We start building some housing between 2015 and 2020, and then we end up in that post-pandemic housing market. And that's where we then see a meaningful uptick in demand and ultimately the shortage. What we'll see in a few slides ultimately, uh, what we'll see in a few slides ultimately is the time that it takes to build housing. I think we're in a lag. Basically, we've fallen behind because the market has shifted quicker than the market can actually react to it from a housing standpoint. I just saw a question pop up from the chat saying, why is the state saying there's a 90,000 unit shortage? There's been a whole bunch of numbers from 90,000 to 100,000 to 150,000 to 300,000 out there. I think what's really being talked about is actually it's cost burdened households. We have a large number, 90,000 or more households that are cost burdened, and we need to address the affordability issue, not an actual, we're behind in 90,000 or 100,000 new housing starts or constructions. So I think there's a nuance in the language and vocabulary that's unfortunately maybe become a bit confusing. So in this last section of this presentation, I want to talk a bit about housing finance and risk and cost because I think we as municipalities, we as the general public, don't always understand it. And I think it's important in the context of understanding housing. So, this first slide here is a conceptual development process, and I state time, money, and risk. So, kind of these 12 steps that a development, say building a 150 apartment building would go through. You come up with the idea, you do some preliminary market research, you evaluate and establish demand, you analyze potential sites, you select a site, you do engineering feasibility, you get a commitment on the site, then you design the development. Municipality doesn't see it till here, and it's probably 1 to 2 years into the process. Then, once it comes out of the land use and permitting process, it goes into financing, then construction, then occupancy, and then property management. Look at the timelines on this. It takes a long time, and that's where this kind of current lag with this, kind of post pandemic spike in demand. But look at my remarks over here. Steps 1 through 8, the developer pays out cash with no guarantee of permitting permit uh, approvals. So in step 8, land use permitting, the developer could be $250,000 into this development and 2 years of work leading up to this point to ultimately get denied. Now, I'm not saying they all need to be approved, but what I'm trying to stress here is the idea of risk. Large amount of risk, large outlay of cash for an uncertain outcome. From step 1 to step 8, the 4 year period of time, if you include the permitting process, in those 4 years of time, the market could change, interest rates can increase, a recession could occur, construction costs could increase, supply chain could be disrupted. Go back to 2006, 2007. What if you started here in 2006 and you arrive here in late 2007 and then the whole market collapses in 2008? You're done. It's over, right? High risk. Uh, Land use litigation can add up to 2 years to this process if it ends up getting litigated. And then step 9, once financing is secured, developer has to start repaying that construction loan, to build this thing. But there's no income until step 11, years later, right? Because it takes 2 years to build it. It then takes, 1 to 2 years to occupy it, depending on how many units, probably about an absorption rate of about 16 units per month, and then operate it. So housing takes a long time to produce. It is very costly and it is very risky. I'm going to look at some more specific housing development cost data. So I want to go through some terms and definitions. Operating expenses are the cost to operate the building. So once that apartment building is constructed, how much does it cost to operate it? Property taxes, annual taxes paid to the municipality, and it's often one of the largest expenses, as you will see in the upcoming slides. Net operating income is the income remaining after operating expenses and taxes are paid. Debt service, the annual mortgage payment required to repay the construction loan or permanent loan, similar to you paying a mortgage on a house. You have a monthly loan payment. Loan to value and cost, banks won't lend more than 60 or 75% of the project cost. So basically, 25 to 40% of the project cost has to be in equity. Got to come up with a large amount of money, to do a $50 million, development of an apartment building. Debt service coverage, the building's income must be at least 20% higher than the mortgage payment. So the developer has to submit a pro forma showing what their costs will be, what their income will be, and they have to be showing that positive income return on the back end, or else the lender's not going to take it. Debt service ratio coverage. Oh, I repeated that. My bad. Net cash flow, the income remaining after all expenses and mortgages are paid, the amount available to distribute between investors and the developer. Developer is the person typically that finds the site, gets the approval, secures the financing, oversees construction, operates the development, and usually invests a small portion of total equity, 5 to 10%. Limited partners, they're the investors in that other equity investment. They're outside investors who provide the majority of equity and they receive priority in cash flow through a preferred return. I'll talk more about that. Preferred return, a minimum annual return, often 8%, must be paid to the investors before the developer receives any cash flow. The point in this, a lot of money goes out on the front end, little money's coming in on the back end, and the developer is actually not in the priority position. His equity investors are, and the debt service to the bank is. So the tables on the right here show the cost of building one apartment unit and a simplified financing structure. In this example, developer contributes 10% of the equity or 3.5% of the total cost, while outside investors contribute the remaining equity. Developers typically include an upfront fee of about 5% to compensate for project risk, the time spent assembling and managing the development. The fee is often the only early compensation the developer receives. So land costs 15 grand, site infrastructure improvements 12 grand, construction costs 251,000. This is all per unit. Soft costs, that's all your engineering, permitting, design, so forth, 25,000. Financing and leasing, 14,000. Developer fee, 15,000. $333,000 to build one unit. Multiply that by 10, 3.3 million. Multiply that by 100, 33 million. By 200, 66 million. If we're doing a 200 unit apartment building. The equity sources. Total equity 116,000. Developer about 11,000 per unit. The partners, the investors 105,000 per unit, and the construction loan about 216,000 per unit. So now the next slide, net cash flow. Early cash flow does not automatically go to the developer. It's first used to pay investors and their required returns. Depending on the partnership structure, early cash flow may either be split based on the equity split, 90-10, or 100% to the investors until their preferred return is met. That means the developer's share of cash flow in the early years is usually very small and often zero, even though the project shows a positive net cash flow on paper. Developer does not typically receive meaningful cash flow until several years into the hold period or upon sale, usually 7 to 10 years out. So this is per unit per year costs or revenues, 31,000, the per unit monthly rent 2,600. So that's 100% of revenues. This is how they break down real estate taxes, operating expenses, net operating income, debt service, net cash flow, and then payment out to investors, and then developers cash flow. Could be as high as $34 per month per unit or $406 per unit per year. That's not a lot of money when you're talking about this large of a cost or this large of a development. So here's the graphic. What does your rent pay for on a new construction apartment unit? 52% goes to debt service, 22% goes to operating, shown here, 13% goes to taxes, and 13% goes to net, uh, goes to yeah, to the cash flow. Sorry, I just froze up there. So it goes to net cash flow. And the majority of that net cash flow is going to the equity investors, probably between years 1 and year 7. I put this out here because I want everyone to really understand how challenging the development side of this equation is. Uh, so many of us want more housing. So many of us want to address affordability, but it takes time. It costs large amounts of money. It's high risk. And while, yes, a developer can make a lot of money, that money is years out. It's not upfront. It's not quick. And a lot can happen. Ultimately, if you don't hit your occupancy numbers, if you end up with higher than predicted vacancies, a development can go into trouble very quickly. So we did a similar calculation or approach to home ownership expenses. Using the CROG median home value of 364,000, using the market interest rate today of 6.31%, or at least when we pulled the market rate, the median CROG mill rate of 34.5 mils. In the cost of housing, we use the state DOH allocations for utilities. The cost of home ownership in the CROG region was calculated. So here we have it. Loan 10% down, mortgage 90%, mortgage payment per year, and then monthly. PMI, because only 10% down, you have to put at least 20% down not to pay PMI. Property taxes, and then the home ownership costs, and so forth. And you see the percentages here. And it actually takes to purchase a $364,000 home in the CROG region to be to cap out at less than 30% of total income, you need an income of almost $130,000. So that's almost $35,000 above the CROG median household income. We then, so homeownership expenses, as shown here, that amount. This gets back to what I was talking about with income and occupied housing, owner occupied, renter occupied. If to purchase the median home value in the CROG region, you require 130,000. That gets back to my point of the home ownership market is servicing the highest incomes. That we see the largest percentage of homeowners above 100 grand and well above the median household income of $96,000. So earlier I asked, who does the home ownership market serve? The highest income households. Once again, just kind of reminding you about how much more challenging it is for a minority household to access the home ownership market than it is for a white household. We then recalculated. So this is what you just saw at the 6.31% interest rate and the 129,000. We recalculated the same costs. Everything's the same, but we changed the interest rate to 5%. The median household income required to access that $364,000 house drops to $119,000. So about 11,000 less. I just want to show the point of the impact that interest rates, inflated interest rates right now are having on home ownership affordability. And then last, we reverse engineered. We did the calculations to figure out what is the maximum home value, a median household income of 95,817, the CROG value would be. And to be affordable, the median household income in the region can afford a property under this formula of $258,665,000. Apply that then to the price to income calculations in the CROG region, and actually a median household income can only afford the median home value in the three lowest home value communities in the region. Now, mind you, I have to put an asterisk on this statement. Median income, median home value, half the houses are higher, half the houses are lower. So could you find a house in Farmington for $260,000? Possibly. So you can't only buy in these three communities, but just showing that median household income can only afford median home value in the three lowest communities within the region. That's where we start seeing a challenge here. And that's where I think we start seeing a disconnect between the housing product and the community amenities that are out there. I think there's first time home buyers that want to access the housing market. They want to become homeowners. They can possibly afford a 300,000 or a $350,000 home, but they're not able to find the home they want in the community they want. And I think that's where a lot of the housing market frustration is. And I think that's where a lot of the housing affordability is an issue. It's not that housing is super expensive, it that there's a mismatch between the households today, the housing product that's available, and the price point at which that housing product is available in which communities. So some final conclusions here. CROG is a moderate to high income region nationally. Housing costs are moderate in relationship to income. Housing affordability is more of a problem of income, households earning too little to afford housing, than a problem of high housing cost. Renters are the most burdened. Housing market, especially new construction, serves the higher income households, both on the rental side and on the home ownership side. As single person households increase, household incomes decrease. So it's becoming more challenging for our smaller households to access the existing housing market. Demographic changes in household type and size are creating a disconnect between the existing housing stock and the housing needs and wants of today's smaller households. The housing stock is aging and was built for the needs and wants of past generations. Single family detached favors larger and family households. Long-term housing supplies outpaced demand. Recently, demand has outpaced supply in Connecticut. And constructing new housing is costly, complex, takes time, risky. New construction requires high rents and high purchase prices, and it requires high returns, even though those high returns come years and years after all the risk of the development. Amenity values of communities may not match with consumer preferences. The community that a household can afford to buy into may not be the community the household wants to live in. And weak demand drivers and slow production, housing production, means that providing a modern housing stock that better suits consumer preferences will take time. This is not something we can solve overnight. It's something that we're going to have to work at long term. So with that, I will say thank you. I'll finally shut up and I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
So if you have a question, use the raise your hand feature. Um, Chris, I see you have a question. I just want to ask one question first. So going back to that slide where you show the number of households compared to the number of units and how the number of units had outpaced up until recently. And so the question was asked and it was addressed about, well, where is this state number coming from? Why are they saying we need so much more? And I just wanted to point out a little more nuance. You got to a part of that nuance that the existing product doesn't always match what is needed, and so thus you need new units to provide that product. I would also ask about a healthy vacancy rate, and also that sometimes you may have an existing unit and people, it's not in a safe or a healthy condition. And so, yes, you have a unit for that household, but it's not the safest, healthiest place for them to live in. So I just wanted to point out there's more nuance as to why we may need more units than what is showing up in this analysis.
Thank you, Heidi. Appreciate that.
All right. Chris, go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Heidi. Um, this is a great presentation, and the institutional knowledge on the project obviously comes through. It's a nice compliment to the data. I do think that kind of between the lines, there doesn't seem to be enough housing being built for lower income households, renters in particular. I had a question about it. First, just a quick point. On slide 27 or so, you guys standardized the denominator for price to income to make it a regional number, right? You switch from like a town's income being the denominator to the region's income being the denominator. And then it looks like you're using it again on slide 43. I would just softly suggest that that become the statistic that you use as a central metric. It's pretty easy to drive from town A to town B for work. That makes it makes even more sense with recent trends in flexible work, but it's also just an easier number with a static denominator to comprehend and to communicate. And I think it probably just makes it a slightly better metric to use to drive community conversation. So just one thought. Um, I was I was going to ask coming into this meeting what the data suggests is like the single most important thing that the region as a community can do to help address any housing gaps that might exist. And for me, slide
Heard that.
34 was, huh? What's that?
Sorry, someone mic'd up. Continue.
I was just going to say I'm probably droning here, so I'll just say that slide 34 was compelling to me. Um, it might lead like someone like me to advocate for rationalizing land use and building permitting frameworks is like the biggest bang for the buck. You know, it's hard to do, but it's not a huge like investment in terms of tax dollars or something like that for the community. It might have a big bang for the buck. Um, the number on the right though threw me. So my if I'm doing my math, once you get to the land use and building permitting, you're up a little over 100, like you're 120 or so. But the second bullet on the right is twice that high. So I was trying to interpret that number.
Oh no, I'm doing cumulative numbers in the
Yes.
cost. So
Yes.
10,000 on the
Right.
research
So
plus
if you
15.
start if you add up 1 through 7, I'm at like 120 or so
Yeah.
mentally.
Oh, so yeah, so then I say up to 250,000. The size of the development's going to matter. If it's, 250 units versus is it 100 units. So I just kind of used a top end kind of number.
Okay.
So,
So thanks.
and I agree with everything you say. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, the takeaway on what's the biggest thing we can do as a region is really about how can we get more housing built. And I don't think it's about a specific product at a specific price point. It's about cumulatively, how can we get more housing built? And to do that, you need to reduce time, money, and risk. And it's really finding ways to kind of streamline this process. At Goman+York, we always like to say swift, simple, and certain. How do you create an approval process that provides that and you'll actually flow more investment? So,
Great. Thanks.
And to raise your hand, you just click on the little heart where it says react and click raise hand, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question or put it in the chat.
Heidi, I have a question for Don. Maybe you can just kickstart the conversation a bit. Don, when you're talking about like a mismatch between what people may want in terms of community amenities and what is available in terms of housing stock and where, could you speak to that? Are you picturing like a West Hartford that has sidewalks and walkability where they might have a lack of stock versus other,
yeah.
the outdated term, older communities? Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Right. So I think it could be many things. So one, I'll just think about, I grew up in Weathersfield in a 1,000 square foot ranch. My mom still lives in the house. It's a nice house. My parents kept it up. It's increased in value. It has a lot of upgrades. But at the end of the day, just the housing product itself is kind of deficient. It's three small bedrooms. It lacks closet space. And, what was it? Three small bedrooms, lacks closet space, has a one-car garage and one bathroom. That product in and of itself is kind of deficient in the housing market. People want at least two bathrooms. They want some closet space, preferably two-car garages, I'd say in most instances. Now, my mom's neighborhood was walkable, but not walkable, no sidewalks. Uh, Not picking on Weathersfield, but just to say, so am I going to pay 300,000 to access that property in say Weathersfield? But Weathersfield, well, it has some interesting stuff and some great amenities, and old Weathersfield is interesting. Doesn't have maybe the cachet and the experience of say West Hartford Center. So if I'm that buyer, I can end up in a position of frustration. Like I'm not finding the housing product I want. I'm having to settle for less closet space. I'm having to settle for smaller rooms. I'm having to settle for a bit of a dated kitchen. And I'm also paying high taxes in Weathersfield, and I'm not getting the community amenities. And maybe it's not West Hartford Center. Maybe it's all of the adult education or libraries and all those other things that West Hartford does a good job of providing. Or maybe it doesn't get me into a Durg B school district and so forth. So I think there's a mismatch between the housing product that's out there, its age, the amenity values of that housing product, and also the amenity values of communities and what they ultimately offer with what the today's household or consumer preferences actually want both in a house and in a community. And thanks for the question, Kyle.
Sure. Thank you.
Any others? A lot of silence for a lot of people.
I have a question, sort of.
Sure.
I live in a small community east of the river.
Yep.
I'm on planning and zoning, and our problem is how do we get housing built? I understand everything I've seen, I understand the numbers. In fact, you didn't surprise me with anything because I've been in this market now for about 4 years looking
Yeah.
at affordable housing. I don't hear what can the communities do to help solve the housing problem.
We're getting to there. We're not fully there. That's why I said these are some conclusions, not full conclusions. But that's ultimately kind of, CROG's trying to determine what is their role on the regional scale. How can they support their communities? And ultimately, how can we get more housing built? So I think as we move further in this process, we're gonna get towards more concrete recommendations that fall into a policy realm. I could spew a bunch of things right now just off the top of my heads, but I don't want to get ahead of us and the process.
Okay.
And if I could just comment on two things that we are currently working on, and you can find some of it on our project website. I can put a link in. We are looking at innovations in housing construction, everything from 3D printing to what's called
Hmm.
modular housing that you're not necessarily seeing in Connecticut. And I had put together a little one-on-one just showing examples of it. I can put a link in the chat. The other thing we've done, and we've gotten additional funding from Department of Housing, is we reached out to all 38 member municipalities and asked them, do you have a site in your town that you think might be good for housing? And we are working on, I think it's a total of 14 or 15 of those sites to, Don and his team are going to look at the feasibility and do a pro forma and figure out, is this a sensible site that might pencil out that may possibly help the community move forward. But as Don said, we're still looking at this data and talking to our communities to figure out specific tools that will help them and us advance housing.
I
Thank
think
you.
we should have lunch.
Do a lunch and learn section, maybe.
It would be fun. It would be fun. The more people you talk to, the more you learn.
Yep.
Yeah.
And thank you for your participation, David. Appreciate it. A couple other cameras turned on, so I'm wondering if there's a couple other questions out there. No pressure.
And I'm going to throw a few things in the chat, a few links.
Thanks, Heidi. Appreciate that.
Don, I just saw a question pop up in the chat. Let me just jump back to it here. Did you examine the impact of material cost to construct and the slowing of time to deliver on material cost in the study pre and post 2020?
Not specifically, but I think the simplest answer to that is our analysts have been doing this work pre and post 2020, and are definitely aware of those differences. So they factor into kind of how the performance get built out, but we haven't really tested it pre and post. I'm just scrolling to see if there's a couple others. There's not. Happy to see Richard Roberts out there. I don't get to see Richard enough, so thanks for showing up, Rich. Lily Rhodes.
Yeah, I'm curious if you know or can direct us to any resources for expanding infrastructure for communities, rural communities, I'm in a rural Eastern Connecticut community, to accommodate our interest in increasing our housing stock when we don't have a municipal infrastructure of water, sewer, all that, that would support um, dense housing development.
Right. We're trying to tackle that in part through the case study, the developments. You know, Heidi said we've gone out to the communities, asked for recommendations on sites. And in the first three case studies we selected, we intentionally selected a site that had access to sewer but not access to water. And we did that to try and, you know, figure out how do those infrastructure costs work into the cost of the development, and then what are the ways to possibly fund them. I'm confident that since we've got the expanded funding to do more communities now, we're going to pick up some more rural communities, and we'll probably have some sites that are even further constrained on both sewers and water. And hopefully, we're going to get to some better answers on that and have recommendations, either A, on resources or how communities could creatively work with a developer to maybe share the cost and so forth in the creation of those infrastructures. So we'll see. So stay engaged through the process, and I'm hopeful that we'll come up with more answers in that area.
And I would point out that the governor signed a housing bill last week, which does entail a wastewater study to be conducted in the next few months. I think it's going to be important for smaller communities to make sure that their voices are heard, that it's also an issue in smaller communities also. So I think that issue will become much more prominent both through our work and through additional housing plans that communities will be working on over the next few years. But
I
it's
welcome
definitely
any
a challenge.
suggestions on how we can advocate for our small rural communities in that process.
I just love that there's now small rural communities coming to the table and saying, help us with housing. Uh, I remember 20 years ago, them all yelling and screaming, we don't want any housing. So it's a nice shift to see out there.
And noticed Eric Thomas had a comment from Coventry in the chat also talking about how they have very limited public wastewater and community
Hmm.
water utilities are stymied beyond small zoning updates, including accessory dwelling units and modernizing and allowing two-family definition in more historically developed parts of town. So they feel the pain too.
And we share the pain, but hopefully us, and ultimately not us, CROG, with us will be able to work through these challenges and hopefully provide greater assistance to all their member communities in tackling these issues. So, well, Heidi, I don't want to force people to ask questions, so I'll do one last call if anyone has a question. Otherwise, I will kick it back to you, Heidi, for, I guess, closure.
Okay. So I put our webpage for the regional housing strategy in the chat. We post updates when we have new products or after our advisory committee meeting or after our advisory committee meets. Also, you can sign up at the bottom of the page if you want periodic updates on the project in general. As I noted, we will post both the slides and the recording probably by the middle of next week, so you can dive back into it or share it with other people on your commissions or in your community. But at any other time, definitely just reach out to us if you have questions, thoughts, or want to be involved more. And I thank you, Don, for the wealth of data tonight. It's probably the third or fourth time I'm seeing some of this data, and I still want to keep diving into it and understanding what does it mean for the CROG region. So I greatly appreciate the level of detail.
Thank you, Heidi. I appreciate that. And let me just thank all of Goman+York staff who actually make me look really good. So I appreciate all their hard work and working through the data. And we appreciate helping CROG with these challenges.
All right. With that, good night, everybody, and thank you for showing up tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.